Marianne. Hello, my name is Marianne, and I am here to tell you today a story that is about family. And so we're talking about my mother and my grandmother, and they lived in Paris during World War II. Sometimes our own stories are the ones we can never tell. But if the story is never told, it becomes something else, forgotten. I tell this story because it is very personal. Sometimes it is a little emotional. And for a very long time, I did not feel that it was appropriate to talk about it. But now I feel that it's time to talk. And let students know that they too can have courage like my grandmother and mother. I'd like to dedicate this project to 120 students who attended school at the same place where my mother attended, at École Pâté. It was also where I attended when I was a little girl visiting grandmother. They lost their lives during World War II. They were murdered by the Nazis and the French collaboration government. How did grandmother find the courage? The courage. What did she do? She helped to save 300 people, Jewish refugees and prisoners of war who were escaping Germany during World War II. It was a very dangerous operation. She worked with another person. He was the train engineer, and between safe houses like my grandmother's and the trains, they were able to smuggle people into an area that was safer for them, out of the occupied zone. So, we want to move on. This is the school where I attended when I was a little girl. There was a boys' side and a girls' side. It was just about exactly like what my mother experienced when she was a little girl too. There it is, it's very big. And you can see a picture of my mother when she was a little girl in her class picture. Can you imagine 120 of your classmates who never came back after the war? It was very hard. So, how did she find the courage to help 300 people? Well, let's move on to the next one. She had a role model. She had her aunt, who was about her own age, who during World War I was a spy for the British. Her code name was Charlotte, but Tante Leonie was a spy and was captured by the Germans during World War I. She was sentenced to be executed as a spy, but they commuted her sentence to life imprisonment. And what you see here is her mugshot from Siegburg prison in Germany. Well, in 1918, she was liberated, and she did survive the war. And I think that may be one of the reasons that grandmother found courage. I think you can't learn courage, but I think if you have a role model, it can inspire you to act courageously. And that's why I give this talk. Another reason I think grandmother found courage is she had street smarts. She was born in the 1880s, and when she was only 5 years old, her mother died. And her father moved the family from the north of France to Paris, the big city, to find work. And grandmother didn't have much of an education. She said that when she was little, she couldn't go to school, and so she sold stockings in the streets of Paris. And then when she was older, she went to work in a factory where she met the love of her life that you see over here. This is her husband, Louis Roux, and that's their wedding picture in 1909. Well, in 1914, just about 5 years later, there was the invasion of Germany invaded Belgium and then France, and that was World War I. And her dear husband, Louis, was called up to service in the French army, and unfortunately, he never got to meet his son, Albert, who was born in 1915, because he died after being wounded on the battlefield. So, another reason I think that she found courage is she really, really did not like Germany and the Germans, because she lost the love of her life, her Louis. Next. But after the war in 1922, she remarried, and she remarried my grandfather, René Morali. He was Jewish, and they had my mother a year later, and you see a baby picture up there. That's her, my mother, Simone, and her half-brother, Albert. And they lived a very nice life. In 1935, grandmother opened a hardware store called Quincaillerie Romo, and you see in front of there's my grandfather with his younger brother, and they were in front of the store there. That's what it looked like then, and pretty much stayed looking that way for a very long time. Well, in 1940, their contentment, their happy life came to an end because Germany invaded France. And in June of 1940, they were successful, and there was an armistice signed between the French and the Germans, and France became an occupied country. It was divided in half, so part of it was free, or so-called free, and the other side was occupied by the Nazis. Another reason I think grandmother had a lot of courage is, can you imagine that happening in your city? She was very patriotic. She loved France, and she really did not like having an invading army take over her country. Well, after Germany invaded France, there was what I call a collaboration government in Vichy, France. It was headed by General Pétain, who was a war hero of World War I. And he was very anti-Semitic, and so was his government. And I don't know if you're familiar with the word, probably are with your literature circles, anti-Semitic. They even had laws that you had to register if you were Jewish. You had to go to your local police station and sign your name and say where you lived and all kinds of other things. During this time, in July of 1940, all French Jews lost their citizenship, which means they no longer had any rights at all. And there were other laws too. Thank you. There were other laws too, like if you were an entertainer, you were no longer allowed to work. If you were a teacher and you were Jewish, you were no longer allowed to work. If you were a doctor and Jewish, you could only see Jewish patients. And on. Judges, police officers, soldiers, they were no longer allowed to have a job. And so very quickly, the Jews of France became impoverished. So grandmother, as I said, she was pretty smart, street smart. And so she knew that she had to do something because her husband was Jewish, and that meant both of her children were considered Jewish, even though she was a Catholic. So very quickly, she had her family separated. She asked her husband to move to their family cottage outside of Paris in the countryside. And so he lived there in Chalon, in this house, for the rest of the war. Fortunately, he was very streetwise as well, and he was able to hide by not hiding. He would go into the cafe every day at around 11, and he would sit with the other guys in the town, probably the police officer and the postman and the farmers, and they would sit around and they would drink, and they would smoke a cigar, they would play cards, they would do all kinds of things that they like to do. And so he just kind of blended into that area, that group. They liked him a lot. He was what they call a bon vivant, and he knew how to live well. And so he hid by not hiding. So grandmother took the two children who would have been considered Jewish because their father was Jewish. They had their grandmother had them baptized. She took them to her first husband's family, who lived outside of Paris, and they had the children baptized. And it was a good thing because very soon afterwards, in October, they were baptized in September. In October, they had to go to the police station and get their ID cards. And because they had this baptismal record, it proved that they were Catholic, and therefore they didn't have a big J put on their card. That probably saved their life. So how did this all work? Well, there was a border. As I said, there was an occupied zone and a free zone. And the free zone was patrolled by French police officers only. And they had a group called the Milice. And they would try and round up Jews and send them to Drancy, which was a big camp. But they weren't Nazi soldiers. Okay, so it was easier to hide in the southern zone, the free zone, than in the occupied zone where Paris was located. It was illegal, if you were Jewish, to cross over in either direction, from the free zone to the occupied zone or occupied to free zone. So there was this big border station called Chalon-sur-Saône, and it was over in the French Alps, close to Switzerland. It was a very important border station, kind of like Blaine when you go to cross into Canada. You know, you have to show your papers, your ID, and all of that. Well, if you were wealthy enough, you could have forged papers made, and you could go on the train and cross from the free zone, from the occupied zone to the free zone. But if you didn't have much money, here's one way that you could do it. So if you could, we're going to play this twice, so just watch. The train engineers, called the cheminots, were part of the resistance, and they would take people in the train engine rooms and hide them in there. They would cross the border, you know, the officers would get on the train and check everybody's papers, but they wouldn't go in the train engine room, so they could cross over the border, cross the train tracks. They would cross the train tracks and then go on to freedom. That was one way that you could cross the border if you didn't have a whole lot of money. So this is a Google map, kind of hard to see, but at the base of the map it says Petit Ceinture, or small belt, and that was a train track that went around Paris, so it was a beltway. The train tracks ended right at the base of the street where grandmother lived. So if you followed these two roads, you'd go up to Rue de Pâté, where grandmother's hardware store is located. So they would walk up the street, Rue de Pâté, and then they would go inside the hardware store. And this is the actual hardware store in 2010, and it still had the name Quincaillerie Homo, and it looked almost exactly like when grandmother was living there. So they would go into the store, and they would go in the back of the store, and they'd have to walk through the warehouse section, and then they would go to the back, and on the floor was a trap door. So on that side is the trap door on the floor. So they would go down, lift up the rug, pull up the trap door, and walk down into the basement. So there's the trap door. They could either go down in the basement or they could go up the stairs. You see the blue stairs there. That went up to the living quarters where grandmother lived with my mother and her little brother Lulu. Now, it was very dangerous to have people in your house. If your neighbors heard people that weren't supposed to be there, they could tell the policeman down the street and say, Madame Morali is hiding people in her store. So my mother was studying to be a concert pianist. And so every day she would practice her scales, her sonatas, her etudes for hours. And the neighbors thought, oh, that's normal. Simone has been playing since she was a little girl. And when she played, the people who were hiding could go to the bathroom, eat, they could walk around, and they could talk. But as soon as she stopped, they had to be silent. So they would stay there several days. Grandmother would give them food, blankets, sometimes a little money for the rest of their journey. And then they would leave the store and go down out the back window of the store and down to the train tracks and get back on the train. There'd be another train waiting there for them. Well, there were so many families that did this. It was very, very dangerous. And in fact, because grandmother had sent her husband away to hide, the Gestapo wanted to know where he was. And they often would come by and pick up grandmother and take her to their station and question her. Where is your husband? And she would say, je ne sais pas. I don't know. Where's your husband? And they'd get really frustrated with her. And one time when they drove her back to her neighborhood, they actually pushed her out of the car while it was running, just to terrify her. And she was scared, but that didn't stop her from what she was doing. But had she been caught, she and the family could have been sent to Drancy. Now, Drancy was a terrible camp right outside of Paris. And if you could click on this. It was a housing development that was never completed. And so there was no plumbing. There were not even walls around all of the apartments. And this is what they used as a prison for Jews that had been caught. They would be taken to Drancy, and then they would be put onto trucks called transports. And from the trucks, they would take them to cattle cars on the train and on to Auschwitz. Very, very few of the Jews who were taken to Drancy and later to Auschwitz ever came back. And that's exactly what happened to Renée, my grandfather's sister. Her name was Fortunée. This is an example of the German record keeping. They had cards on every single Jew in Europe, practically. And they kept track of when they were caught, where they were caught, where they were taken. And this shows Tante Fortunée, and she never came back from Auschwitz, sent to Auschwitz in May of 1944, just a few weeks, very few weeks before the liberation of Paris. So it was tragic. Well, during this time, unbeknownst to my grandmother, my mother, who was a teenager at the time, was working for the resistance called the FFI, Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, or French Forces of the Interior. There she is. She was a courier and a secretary, and they would use young women as couriers to send messages back and forth, because young women were thought to be very able to memorize accurately messages. And because they were women and they were young and they were pretty, they were able to circulate. They were able to walk around without being, not being picked up by the police or the German soldiers. They thought, oh, there's just a pretty woman walking down the street. Well, at Liberation, which was August 20th, 1944, my grandmother put on her FFI armband. And then my mother put hers on. And then her little brother, Lulu, he put his on, and they looked at each other and they said, "Toi? You too?" It was so secret to be in the Resistance. It was a secret army, and you were not allowed to tell anybody what you were doing, including your parents. So the kids knew what grandmother was doing, but she had a big surprise when France was liberated, or when Paris was liberated. In 1944, the train engineer wrote this document, and it was signed by 6 other people to verify that grandmother did the things that I'm telling you she did. So you can see, I, the undersigned, certify that Mrs. Morali, hardware store owner, well served the French nation, and you can read it yourself, saving 300 Jewish refugees and prisoners of war escaping Germany. And, oops, that's okay. So, Monsieur Fuman, who was the train engineer, signed it, and so did some of the people that we actually were able to find this January and verify that they were saved by grandmother. It was pretty amazing. Very amazing to find them. They're 86 years old and 84. There was Monsieur Zenati and his children, his wife, and his wife's sister that we were able to verify. So you might ask, well, how do you know that she actually did all of this? And we can now say we have a witness who remembers spending the last night of their days in Paris. They were in grandmother's house, and at dawn, grandmother put them on into a truck, and they were driven over the border. So we do know that. So I want you to have courage. I want you to use my grandmother and my mother as role models of courage. Avoir du courage. Because it said, if you save just one life, it is as if you have saved an entire world. And if you take one life, it is as if you destroyed an entire world. Thank you.